Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
The 6th, 7th and 8th waves of the attack come one after the other, each about 100 planes, from the port side and from astern. A hunch sends shivers up my spine. Is the enemy taking advantage of our loss of speed and trying to damage the rudder? We are covered all over with wounds. What is more, we're down to half our power, helpless. Forming beautiful patterns, 2 torpedo tracks chase after our giant stern. I turn my back to the stern, wringing my sweaty hands, and wait for the impact with senses honed. The torpedoes hit aft. Floating in the air for a moment, the stern is mantled in pillars of flame, pillars of water. Although damage to both rudders, main and auxiliary is slight, the auxiliary rudder's steering room falls victim to flooding. The auxiliary rudder is stuck hard to port, so even with the main rudder to starboard, the ship can make turns only to port. One side of our body is paralyzed. And that is Ensign Mitsuro Yoshida, a radar officer aboard the Imperial Japanese naval battleship Yamato on the 7th of April, 1945.
Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland for the second episode in our series about Okinawa. And today we're focusing on the battle at sea because, after all, it's in the Pacific, this battle. It's a naval battle with some army and marine stuff as a sort of salad dressing. That's right, isn't it, Jim? Is that the right way of looking at it?
Yeah, no, I think so. And, you know, Okinawa might be 60 miles long and intermittently 3 and 15 miles wide, but it is absolutely in the middle of the Pacific. So the sea everywhere. You know, the Japanese who are aircraft are coming over, they've got to come from Kyushu, they've got to come from southern Japan, 360 miles away, something like that. Yep. The Americans have got to come from all corners. They've got to come from, obviously, originally the United States, but then naval bases such as Alifi and Guam and so on.
Pearl Harbor.
It's a massive monster operation, and it's all converging over the dark blue waters of the Pacific. And a really, really key feature of this is Operation Tengo, launched on the 6th and then 7th of April 1945. And this is the all-out sort of kamikaze banzai attack, both from aircraft but also with surface vessels.
So this is an offensive the Japanese have been planning and building up to. In the meantime, the Americans have launched their offensive, Operation Iceberg, on Okinawa itself. The landings have begun on the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, Easter Sunday. If you're a GI, choose which one is more appropriate. But this kamikaze effort has been a thing that the Japanese have been summoning up and getting together, and it's finally unleashed. And I think kamikazes, it's one of those things of the Second World War, it cuts through. Everyone knows what we're talking about. Everyone knows what that word means. Everyone knows what it is symbolic of, but what's actually going on underneath the hood here with these kamikazes? It's quite the most amazing story.
Well, it really, really is. And the kamikazes really, they first come in sort of the second half of 1944. You know, there's kamikazes over the Philippines, for example, but boy, are they here in Okinawa. And this is largely because, you know, they're running out of everything. They're running out of fuel, they're running out of planes, and they want a kind of pointless symbolic gesture.
And also, let's face it, getting someone to fly a plane into a ship, if you can persuade them to do that, is easier than getting someone to dive bomb a ship. Technically simpler, isn't it? They don't need to learn how to dive bomb. No. You could take a less experienced pilot and get more out of him in this desperate stage of the war. He's probably going to get shot down dive bombing anyway. So you might as well, if you're going to spend his life, you might as well spend his life this way. There's so much murderous cynicism. And you've got a load of
obsolescent aircraft that you might as well get rid of them.
Exactly. The sort of murderous cynicism at the core of so many of these Japanese decisions is sort of plainly in view in the Kamikaze project, but also people's reactions to it, which I think are very, very interesting. And, you know, some people may think of this as sort of, you put on the headband and off you go, automaton style, but that's not what's going on at all, is it?
No, it really, really isn't. At Kanoya Air Base, for example, which is where Admiral Yugaki, who's the commander of those who've listened to the first episode in this series will remember that he's the commander of the Japanese 5th Air Fleet, which is a combined naval and army air fleet. But there's a whole load of kamikaze pilots living there as well, and they're living in the absolute finest barracks. Their quarters are perched on a babbling brook that weaves its way gently through lush bamboo forest, meadows dotted with wild roses, and, clearly the shadow of death hangs over these young men in a very big way, but because they're about to pay the ultimate sacrifice, they're allowed to kind of relax, wander through the meadows, write poetry, drink well. And when much of the nation is starving, they're getting gifts from the locals, which includes chickens, pigs, eggs, the odd oxen to be slaughtered the night before, all that kind of stuff. And they've also got local girls sort of washing and cooking for them. It's kind of sort of lower end kind of geisha thing going on. They're called labor service maidens, and they serve them and they do become emotionally attached. But it seems that in a pretty chaste way. The whole thing is just extraordinary.
This isn't the RAF going to the pub, though, is it, in Lincolnshire?
Absolutely not. No, there's a kind of spiritual side to it, a kind of sort of Zen side to it, where they spend these last days in sort of quiet contemplation and, gather their thoughts. And
yeah, the service maidens are covering their aircraft with cherry blossoms and cloth and origami dolls and stuff, aren't they, at night?
Yeah.
What is different about this to say the RAF in Lincolnshire? Is the RAF in Lincolnshire?
Is this as a death cult?
There's a sincere hope you're coming back. The casualty rates if you're flying in Bomber Command or whatever. It's a sticky wicket, but there's not the idea that this is a completely one-way ticket. I mean, this is death cult stuff, isn't it?
It's complete death cult, yeah.
God, shocking.
It absolutely is. And dolling this up as some sort of great spiritual ascetic is ridiculous because it's not. It's ultra-violent and selfish and cruel.
Well, it's the murderous cynicism at the core of things. Yeah, just disgusting.
Murderous cynicism, exactly.
Yeah. And so when it's time for them to get into their planes, the service maidens line the flight lines and weep, and they wave boughs of cherry or rising sun flags. And they also, and how macabre do you like it, folks? They also collect locks of hair and nail clippings to send to the pilot's family. Grim, isn't it? Really grim.
But what's really interesting is when the kamikazes are first created in 1944, they do attract plenty of volunteers. But by the spring of 1945, and this is where we're at with Okinawa, commanders notice that attitudes are definitely shifting. It turns out that a lot of them have been asked to volunteer, in inverted commas, in such a way that's been impossible to refuse. Because, there's a huge amount of play, particularly in 1930s and 40s Japan, about honor and, not disgracing your family and all this kind of stuff. And so, that is how it's presented. And one staff officer notes they developed a pressure, not entirely artificial, which encouraged volunteering. And it is understandable that this change in circumstance would affect a change in the attitude of the men concerned. Yeah, quite right, because they're being coerced into doing something they don't want to do for obvious reasons.
Turbocharged white feather idea, isn't it, basically?
Yeah. Yeah. There's this amazing story of this one cadet who, there's a training base at Mito, and the entire flight of cadets, they think they're volunteering for the Air Force to be trained as pilots, where they've got a sporting chance. And they're suddenly told the whole class is basically said, right, we'd like you to volunteer for the kamikazes. And, he says, I don't even remember telling my feet to move. It was like a strong gust of wind whooshed up from behind the ranks and blew everyone forward a step, almost in perfect unison. Peer pressure,
But what's remarkable about this is you hear stories of whole lines of men stepping forward to volunteer from the war. That's an absolutely common occurrence, isn't it? There are enough accounts of that in every service, in every nation. But for a thing where you actually know that you are going to die, rather than that you're going to risk your life, it takes everything
to the next different level, isn't it?
It's everything to the next level, yeah.
The other thing I think is really interesting is that half the kamikazes of 1945 have been drawn from university students. They're cosmopolitan, intellectual, fully versed in Western ways. There's Christians, there's communists. They're not all kind of sort of automatons, pro the government, ultra nationalists by any stretch of the imagination.
But them being drawn from university isn't necessarily a surprise. The guys who did 9/11, Mohammed Atta, they're all university graduates, weren't they? They're all clever people.
Yeah, but they're really into it.
Yes, that's true. They are really into it. It's this kind of pressure, this kind of volunteering isn't the sort of province only of the stupid. You know what I mean? It can affect anybody, can't it? This desire to, and they know they're going to die. Although, as we'll see, there is a way of kind of bending some of this, but you're volunteering definitely to die. Very, very peculiar, isn't it? I mean, you have increasingly the men don't want to go, though, do they? And Admiral Yokoi notes attitudes range from the despair of sheep headed for the slaughter to open expressions of contempt for their superior officers.
the night before the missions, kamikazes hold these sort of bacchanalian piss-ups, where they drink lots of sake and they rage and they weep and they sing songs and they curse and they know it's the last night of life. So it's kind of last meal stuff. And, what they then find into sort of marching into April and May 1945 is that pilots more and more begin to return, complaining of engine problems.
Well, we touched on that in the last episode, didn't we? There were several
and others are ditching
failures.
planes at the sea near islands. And, pilots have been known to sneak out at night and sabotage their aircraft. And after returning to base 9 times, one pilot was then executed by firing squad. But you can get away with turning a couple of times.
God.
Do you remember there was the attack on one of the Task Force 58 ships in Alifi? 24 went out, didn't they? And only one actually makes it. And a whole lot of them just disappear. I mean, presumably into the ocean, but because they're not very good. But you do wonder whether some of them have just sort of, crash landed on islands or something.
They're inexperienced too, aren't they? So got lost, run out of fuel, put it down in the sea, lost track of the horizon, all those additional problems. So they're not really getting bang for their buck, are they? Is the other
well, not entirely. There's a couple of examples we can give here, and one is Tadao Hayashi. So he is drafted from Kyoto University, and in his student writings, Hayashi denounced the war aims and holds that Japan's defeat is desirable and necessary. But at the same time, he's determined to die for his country. And he writes in his notes, the situation is tense indeed, but for me, it is all right for Japan to be destroyed. Historical necessity led to the crisis of our people. We rise to defend our people in the land we love. And he dies age 24 during the Okinawa battle. And then we've got this other chap, Ichizo Hayashi.
Yeah, who's a Christian from Fukuoka. He takes a Bible with him, along with Kierkegaard, Sickness Unto Death, and a photo of his mother. And he writes her a last letter. I will put your photo right on my chest. I shall be sure to sink an enemy vessel. When you hear over the radio of our success in sinking their vessels, please remember that one of them is the vessel I plunged into. I will have peace of mind knowing that Mother is watching me and praying for me. And he dies at age 23 near Okinawa on the 12th of April, 1945. And it's not just aerial kamikaze, but marine seaborne kamikazes as well.
Marine-borne kamikazes. Let's just kind of hold that thought for a moment and actually go to the landings, because we should explain what happens on Love Day. And the reason it's called Love Day rather than D-Day is because by this point D-Day is so famous. Everyone just associates D-Day on the 6th of June in the cross-channel invasion. Yeah. And suddenly you can't have D-Day again because it's too confusing. So they just call it Love Day, which is a bizarre choice of words.
Well, there's some murderous cynicism on the other side as well, in that case.
Well, quite.
So thing is, though, even before they hit the troops, and we said that Japanese strategy is to basically bunker themselves, hunker down, and pick their battles in order to preserve ammunition and to bleed the Americans as hard as they can, knowing they're going to lose.
Yeah, so don't expose yourself. Don't do what the Germans do, which is counterattack and expose yourself and get cut to pieces. Just stay in your tunnels.
Yeah.
This is not about driving the Americans back into the sea.
No.
This is about holding them and delaying them and causing as much damage to their navies and air forces as they possibly can. That's what this is about.
Exactly. So even before they hit the beach, they know there's little or no enemy fire. There's a few machine guns. The odd mortar round comes over, but that's about it. And most come ashore without facing any enemy fire at all. And by the end of the first hour, 16,000 men are ashore. Eat that, Omaha Beach.
Can you imagine release on that when you've been so G'd up? When the 1st Marine Division has been told, to expect casualties of 80 to 85%. And then suddenly it's a walk in the park. Can you imagine how casual you're going to become as a result of that? By sunset on Love Day, on the 1st of April 1945, the landing forces have beachheaded more than 8 miles in length, 3 miles in depth, 50,000 men ashore, and just 28 killed in action, 104 wounded and 27 missing. And that's it.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. So they're ashore. They've
churning
done it.
That many soldiers, 50,000 guys, 28 KIA could on a quiet day anywhere just be sporadic fire or whatever, isn't it? Or road traffic accident sort of thing.
Yeah, and Love +1 and Love +2 and Love +3 and all the rest of it is similar. There's not a lot going on. They're probing inland. The forces are splitting. The whole load of them are heading north, clear the northern part of the island, then pushing southwards. And there's literally nothing going on at all. It's incredibly quiet, incredibly easy in those first days of the Okinawa invasion.
Yeah.
And the Americans are clearly making all the running. But then all that changes on Friday, the 6th of April, 1945, when the Japanese finally launch Operation 10 Go.
Now, the thing about 10 Go is, again, as you said, Jim, it's been quiet up to this point. There's been enemy air attacks, but there's not really much going on. And Spruance assumes...
This is Admiral Spruance, the commander of the Fifth Fleet.
Yeah, assumes that this is because the raids they've done on Kyushu have been effective ahead of the invasion. They've done the job of suppressing Japanese air power. And the Americans consistently underestimate Japanese air numbers, fighter numbers and aircraft numbers. They never get it right.
Well, this ability of the Japanese to just constantly replicate themselves.
Yeah, yes, they're like a video game.
There's a touch to the Hydra head about this, you know.
Yeah, respawning. And each carrier group's conducting 3 flight operations per day. And on the 4th day, they withdraw to replenish. So they've been relentlessly attacking Kyushu. Yeah. So come Friday, the 6th of April, it's cool and breezy day. Task Group 58-2 are replenishing. So Admiral Sherman's 58-3 and Clark's 58-1 of Task Force 58 who are on the line. They're rotating their assets, basically. So effectively, 58-2 are in reserve, as it were, as they replenish. Then an hour after dawn, here it comes. A Picket destroyers north of Okinawa pick up radar traffic inbound from north. Japanese planes have scattered a vast amount of window, but the raid is too big to hide. So the Japanese are using window now.
Yep.
Mitcher.
Yeah, so Mitcher is the commander of the Task Force 58.
And he says, basically, get my fighters up.
Yep.
We're going to get the bombers in the hangars and get the fighters to provide as much cover as possible. Because that's what they do. They stick the fighters up, don't they? In anticipation of this raid.
On CAPs, CAPs, which are known as Combat Air Patrol, rather.
Yeah. Soon, they're vectored towards this incoming raid.
Because they've all got radar.
I know.
This is like the air defense system of Fighter Command in 1940, but at sea. I mean, the scales of sophistication are just extraordinary in comparison to what they were in 1940. Because they've got radar, because they've got controllers on the Picket ships directing the air patrols, they're able to vector the naval fighters onto the incoming masses. And the US fighters are just tearing into the Japanese air formations. Which, this is exactly like, when we were doing the series on Big Week and we were talking about the qualitative advantage of the Americans, arriving in England with 350 hours in their logbooks compared to kind of Luftwaffe new boys who were kind of, lucky if they'd got 90 to 100. And it's just such a mismatch. And this is exactly the same here. There are still a few veterans around, but they're few and far between. The vast majority of pilots, particularly if they're kamikazes, are roughly trained, and they're just simply not a match for the highly skilled, experienced pilots of the United States Navy. And, in moments, 60 Japanese planes are going down in flames just from the first wave.
Amazing.
Lieutenant Lewis Midgley Walker is a naval officer aboard a transport ship, and he's watching the battle, and he goes, "How they came in singles, twos, and bunches, gliding, diving, swooping, some hugging the water. It seemed they never stopped coming." This is a massed attack and a half.
Yeah.
And you've also got watching the Time and Life war correspondent Bob Sherrod, who's on Admiral Turner's flag, the El Dorado. And he goes, "Terrific streams of ack-ack poured toward the plane from every ship within 2 miles. When the Jap was 300 feet from his target, he flamed, winged over, and fell into the shallow water."
But by the end of the 6th of April, for all this, by the end of the 6th of April, 26 American ships have been hit by kamikazes.
Some get through.
Yeah, because they're going to, aren't they?
Yeah.
6 of these ships are sunk, including 2 Victory freighters and 1 minesweeper, 1 landing ship tank, 2 destroyers, the Bush and the Calhoun.
Yeah, it's like playing British Bulldog. Yeah. Some will always get through.
Yeah, it's the Picket destroyers who are out detecting this. They're the key to any further
Well, we'll
carnage.
touch on those in a minute. It's an amazing job that they do. And again, it's another example of the sort of increased sophistication.
Yeah. And the USS Essex nearly breaks the single-day carrier air kill record by shooting down 65 enemy aircraft. But it's still not enough. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you compare it to the Germans in Big Week. The Germans haven't come to the conclusion, well, in that case, the thing to do is fly directly into the bombers, but fly into the bomber stream. And that's the way to disrupt it, is to use the aircraft as a suicide weapon. They haven't come to that conclusion. The Japanese have. And it's one way through the fact that they have inexperienced pilots and the Americans are much better flyers. A peculiar Achilles heel, but it's one that's actually working. And then we also have the Yamato, which is where we started this episode.
Oh, my goodness me. What a story this is. I mean, Yamato Banzai attack is ordered by Admiral Soimo Toyota, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, from his command bunker in Hiyoshi. Very easy to issue orders like that when you're in a bunker on land.
Well, his officers aren't happy about this, of course, and they aren't happy that he's still in his bunker.
Not on the Yamato.
And so Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who's the commander of the Second Fleet, is strongly against sending the Yamato on a suicide mission. He tells Vice Admiral Ryonosuke Kusuka, who's Toyoda's chief of staff, that this is a pointless sacrifice of ships, ammunition, fuel, and trained fighting men who would be needed to defend the homeland.
Well, quite. So the idea behind it, the reason why they don't want to do it is Imperial General Headquarters don't want to see the mighty Yamato surrendered.
No.
At the end of the war. So what they think is, right, what we'll do is we'll do a sort of sacrificial banzai charge with the Yamato at the head, with a cruiser, the Yahagi, and 8 destroyers, and they'll just, like the Kamikazes, they'll just plow straight towards Okinawa, get there, beach their vessels, and then just be used as a firing platform until they're kind of destroyed. On no level is this a good idea. It's a terrible, murderous idea and completely pointless. And we've talked over and over and over again about the delusion scales of the Nazis at the end of the war, but also the Imperial Japanese. And this is right up there with one of the most delusional, bonkers missions of all. But that's what they've got to do.
It's got to be said, though, every single one of these decisions is sort of, as I said, murderous cynicism. It's so about death.
Yes, it's just disgusting, isn't it?
Yeah. Another naval officer, Tamechi Hara, who's the commander of a light cruiser, the Yahagi, calls it a ridiculous mission, just like throwing an egg at a rock.
Well, he's quite right.
He's got that right, isn't he?
Yeah. But Kosaka tells them that Imperial General Headquarters just don't want the disgrace of seeing these ships surrendered at the end of the war. So everyone who's on this, who's earmarked for this fort, there have been terrific pride to be part of the crew of the Yamato, which is, one of 2 of the largest battleships ever built. Absolutely enormous. I think there's sort of 72,000 tons, if I remember rightly. Yeah. When a normal battleship is about 36, 38, something like that. I think the Duke of York was something like 42, perhaps. But this is 78. It is absolutely colossal. It has been the pride of the Imperial Japanese fleet, state of the art, and the scale of it just enormous.
Yeah.
Now this crew, they've got to sort of channel that pride into a suicide. It's just crazy. But anyway, the night before the Yamato gets put to sea, we're now on the 5th of April, rather like the Kamikazes, there's a general ration of sake handed round to the entire crew. Everyone gets pissed. The second in command bellows over the tannoy, "Kamikaze Yamato, be truly a divine wind." Well, I'm sure that perked everyone up.
Hooray!
Hooray. Oh no. Apparently there's sort of bottles of sake sort of rolling around the decks the following morning. But anyway, they get up very, very early. Free cigarettes are handed out to all the crews who are sort of still nursing their hangovers. And later the column forms up, and this is Yamato, the Yahagi, and 8 destroyers, and they sail down the coast of Kyushu. And they're still off the coast. They haven't cleared the southern tip of Kyushu when dusk falls and crewmen on the Yamato notice that ashore the cherry trees have started to blossom. This sort of symbol of the beauty of the Japanese home islands. And there they are, leaving it behind for the last time. By dawn the following morning, there's a waning crescent moon, ahead of the rising sun, and behind them Kyushu is receding. And Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, who we quoted at the beginning of this episode, he's a radar officer on the Yamato's bridge. He goes, "Not a single escorting plane could be seen, nor was one to be seen from this time on. We were literally abandoned." And they all feel this clearly, very sort of palpably. Of course, they're tracked from the outset because US submarines off the Bungo Suido, which is a channel between Kyushu and Shikoku, they've picked up the Yamato's progress, and then search planes from the USS Essex also spot the force at around 8:23 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, the 7th of April. And they're then circling out of range high above the whole time. And everyone down below on this little force of 10 ships can see these planes twinkling in the sunlight, circling over them, charting their every move. I mean, just as we're telling this story, aren't you feeling a sense of sadness about this?
No, disgust. I can't be sad about this.
So awful.
I can only be disgusted by it all. That anyone would think this was a good idea and that anyone would then obey these orders. And the Americans they think the Yamato is trying to evade detection and deception. Because, of course, they can't comprehend that you're going to do this with a warship.
Yeah. But equally, Spruance recognizes that this is a chance to kind of see these guys off and see off the infamous Yamato there and then. So he sends a powerful battleship cruiser destroyer squadron under Admiral Deo, who you may remember was sort of hammering in charge of hammering the coast. But Admiral Mitcher and the Task Force 58 aviators, they're thinking, well, sod that. We want to get this maybe.
Yeah.
Their range from their carriers is 238 miles. So timing is clearly key, but they're in the race to intercept the Yamato and its escorts. These guys are going to win. And from 10:18 a.m. on the Saturday, the 7th of April, 3 carrier task groups launched 386 aircraft. So this is 180 fighters, 75 dive bombers, and 131 torpedo planes. And they're all heading for the Yamato, the Hagi, and these 8 destroyers.
And all morning, you've got seaplanes high over the Yamato, out of range but watching the progress. There's a growing sense of doom on the ship. And the first wave of incoming carrier planes appeared on the Yamato's radar screens at 12:20 p.m. The navigator says, over 100 hostile planes are headed for us. 10 minutes later, the first US planes are spotted, and we will take a break there. And you will, after the break, find out exactly what happens to the Yamato. I think you're a pretty good idea, though, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, but you know, what happens and how it happens.
We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We left you 10 minutes later. The first US planes were spotted. There's over 100 hostile planes headed for the Yamato, which is on a kamikaze mission. So, like, as I said in the last part, this is disgusting. These lives being squandered for nothing. And bright people and well-trained people. And it doesn't matter how bright or well-trained they are, just people. It's vile, the whole thing. So there is no Japanese air cover. So the Americans can take their time. They don't have to worry about fending off fighter escort or any of that, do they? God, it's vile. They first the American fighters start off by swooping in, dropping smaller bombs and strafing. Then you got the SB-2C Curtiss dive bombers who are dropping 1,000-pound bombs. And then Avengers with torpedoes, most aiming at the Yamato's port side in the hope of capsizing her in that direction.
Of course, there's absolutely loads and loads of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. I mean, it's sort of pumming away, black puff sort of dotting the skyline. But it's pretty inaccurate. And without having to kind of sort of dodge Japanese aircraft as well, you know, naval anti-aircraft fire is incredibly good and effective when you've got very, very good, highly trained crews. But they're clearly not the best on this lot at this stage of the war. What becomes very clear is the greatest concern for the American pilots is an anti-aircraft fire. It's actually colliding with one another. There's so many of them coming from different heights and different angles. But the Japanese ships are they're surging along at 27 knots, which is a decent lick. The Yamato maneuvers violently as the first sort of bombs fall around it. You know, geysers of water spewing all around her, and the first hell divers sort of narrowly missing. But then 4 heavy bombs strike the great battleship one after the other, hitting anti-aircraft batteries and tossing bodies and debris into the air. And the superstructure is then strafed with 50 caliber machine guns, and several on the bridge are killed. And then suddenly there's the silvery wakes of torpedoes streaking towards the ship from several directions. And the Yamato manages to dodge some, but not all. And 3 hit the port side in quick succession. And then a 4th hits kind of further aft. Every single blow, the huge ship is sort of lurching and kind of almost lifted out of the water with this huge blow. One of the destroyers on its port side, the Kamikaze, is then hit as well and drops out of formation and soon after sinks. And when it sinks, it just leaves a little sort of circle of white foam on the surface. The one cruiser, the Hagi, is also struck in the engine room, killing the entire engineering crew. And then between 6 and 7 bombs then straddle her entire length. And the Hagi is soon reduced to a burning, listing wreck, incapable of any kind of maneuver whatsoever. So the destroyer, the Izokaze, moves in to help, but is hit in turn by 2 bombs. And, fires rage and she slews off helplessly, flames and smoke gushing. And the Suzuki is also hit and crippled, but that one does manage to limp away. So, they're all being absolutely hammered. And the bottom line is the Yamato is in big trouble already. So the listing is corrected by counter-flooding, but fires are raging through the ship, and the firefighting and damage control teams have been decimated already. So the fires are never really brought properly under control. That's the problem.
And then the second wave of American planes arrives. It's just relentless, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely.
On the bridge, Admiral Seiichi Ito is seen standing resolutely, arms folded. Oh, to know what he's thinking. Control between different parts of the ship are breaking down.
Well, because they can't communicate because there's fires raging, electrical cables are being burned and cut and water's pouring in. Wow. I mean, it's just horrendous.
Around 1:10 in the afternoon. In this second round, the Yamato takes 5 or 6 more torpedoes on the port side, at least 1 on starboard.
Just boom, boom, boom. I mean, it's just like one after the other.
Yeah, there are no spoilers in this story. A further torpedo then explodes against her stern, destroying the rudder, which is the one in the description at the start. Helldivers drop countless bombs and along her decks and fire their cannons and machine guns, while Hellcats and Corsairs swoop in and shoot up the remaining anti-aircraft positions.
You've just got this image, haven't you, of smoke, puffs of anti-aircraft are still dotted above, but just this swirling swarm of hornets kind of, hurtling across the decks, bullets flying, bombs falling, the silvery streak of torpedoes. You're sort of thinking of sort of hyenas on a dying elephant or something. This once mighty beast just being kind of mortally wounded, and more so with every kind of hit. Just terrible.
Well, they're swooping in like seagulls after a trawler, aren't they?
Yes. That's an even better description, yeah. So anyway, Ensign Yoshida records incessant explosions, blinding flashes of light, thunderous noises, and crushing weights of blast pressure. I mean, goodness me.
I mean, the other thing is the ships with it are also being smashed to pieces, aren't they? It's a complete free-for-all. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Before the war, all sorts of people had to convince the US Navy that air power was an important component in naval warfare. It was going to be. There was great argument over whether you could use air power in war. And here are the Americans absolutely perfecting its effect and bringing it to decisive and deadly effect. So the remaining destroyers are hit. Asashimo and a Kasumi are damaged and sunk. The Yahagi's hit by 4 more torpedoes.
So that means all 8 of them have been hit by this point.
It's crazy. The Yahagi, has been hit by 7 or 8 bombs as well as 4 more torpedoes. Captain Hara knows the end's near. Bomb blasts are hurtling debris and bodies into the air. He feels the entire ship crumbling. Our dying ship quaked with the detonations.
Well, and he sees rivets popping on the deck.
Explosions finally stopped, but the list continued as waves washed blood pools from the deck and dismembered bodies fell into the rolling sea. So now the Yamato's listing badly. The captain, Kosaku Aruga, now takes the decision to flood the starboard engine and boiler rooms, but in doing so is consigned all the men in there to death. They sound a buzzer, but it's not enough time for them to escape, and they all drown. And then there's a third wave of aircraft.
Then there's the third wave. I mean, can you believe it? So by this point, the Yamato is listing really badly. Speed has dropped to 10 knots. More bullets, more bombs, more torpedoes. Then it's listing to 35 degrees. Then it's listing at 45 degrees. And Admiral Ito shakes hands with the surviving staff officers, then retreats to his cabin, and he's never seen again. At 2:06 p.m., 6 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, Captain Hara, who is the skipper of the cruiser Yahagi, gives the order to abandon ship. And he finds himself in the water, repeatedly sucked down, but manages to resurface and eventually cling to an oil-drenched bit of debris with a handful of others. And he's picked up and rescued, which is why we have his account, because he kept an account of what happened. But meanwhile, the Yamato is now listing at 80 degrees. So basically, it's almost over. Yeah. And Captain Aruga lashes himself to a binnacle, but Ito's chief of staff now orders every man for themselves. So Ensign Yoshida jumps out and finds himself swimming through congealed oil. And as the Yamato began sinking, he finds himself repeatedly sucked under. The ship is pulling down, it's pulling him too. And he's below the surface and thinking, this is it, I'm going to drown. When suddenly there's this immense underwater explosion and a giant pillar of flame and a blinding flash of light sort of bursts through the water and leaps up into the sky. And the force of this pushes him back to the surface. And this is what saves him. So again, we have his account. And I strongly recommend anyone who wants to know more about it. It's called Requiem for the Battleship Yamato. It's an incredible account. It's a very, very short account, but it's an amazing piece of wartime literature. He begins treading water, looking for the debris to kind of clutch onto and eventually find some. And like the captain of the Yahagi is also picked up. But the column of smoke above this immense battleship rises to 20,000 feet. And the explosion of it is seen in Kagoshima, which is 125 miles away. And when the cloud and the smoke lift, there's no sign of the Yamato. Only 23 officers and 246 enlisted men survive. So the ship has gone down with more than 3,000 men.
4,000 Japanese sailors die in this entirely pointless. The headquarters have got what they want. You're sad. I'm disgusted.
Well, I'm sad and disgusted, but I feel this this sort of lead weight, this albatross of despair. Just talking about it, just the awfulness of it. It's just, it's so tragic. It's so needless. It's just, So close to the end of the war. What's the point? While Task Force 58's aircraft have been away, the ship have been attacked by a further 100 plus kamikazes, and most are shot down, although one does hit the battleship Maryland and another hits the flight deck of the carrier Hancock. But these are, contained pretty quickly. And these, Operation Tengo is known as floating chrysanthemum attacks. Japanese love sort of painting things in terms of blossom and flowers and everything else. So floating chrysanthemum attacks, and actually there's 10 of them. So 6th of April and now the 7th of April, those are the first 2 of 10. And in between these large-scale raids, there's further daily attacks of kind of, of smaller nature. So in other words, there's sort of no let-up. These kamikazes keep coming, as well as conventional bombers as well. And they're always delivered by an assortment of aircraft. A number of them are these sort of obsolescent planes. And they've also been bolstered by Oka rocket-propelled manned suicide missions, which are also kind of insane. These are kind of like rocket pad things which are attached to kind of mother vessels and then released and piloted straight in. I mean, just bonkers.
So desperate.
But anyway, the amazing thing, to continue the theme of grand delusion, Imperial General Headquarters, they allow themselves to believe that Tengo has been this sort of huge success and that future floating chrysanthemum are a huge success. And even Admiral Ugaki concludes that some 150 vessels have been hit just on Operation Tengo alone. And he records in his diary that the sea around Okinawa had thus turned into a scene of carnage. Well, yes, it had, but from wrecked kamikazes and Japanese aircraft plunging into the sea in balls of flame rather than burning vessels. He's convinced that 4 American carriers have been sunk on the 6th of April alone. But after reports have come in from the 32nd Army on board Okinawa, which has been watching all this, these figures are adjusted from 150 ships to 35 that have been hit and 22 sunk. But it wasn't even that. Only 6 vessels are sunk on the 6th of April. So some are getting through. They are a constant pain in the arse. They're exhausting for the defenders to have to deal with. But in terms of effect, they're pretty half-cock is the truth of it, or even quarter-cock.
Yes, it's sort of in the balance, isn't it, though? Because the Americans are very much perturbed by this. They haven't accommodated this in their planning, have they, to start with? This is sort of new and unexpected and unprecedented in its amount. So combat crews and aircrew are really, they're feeling the strain of having to stick these cat patrols up all the time. And it's the Picket destroyers. You mentioned the Picket destroyers earlier, Jim.
Yeah. Well, they're amazing, and they're a kind of new development.
Yeah, a radar screen well north of Okinawa, and they're early warning, basically.
Yep.
But simultaneously very vulnerable. And I think people who remember the Falklands War will remember this, that ships would go out on Picket, and they were the ones that got exocetted, weren't they? Is the thing. Royal Navy destroyers. So it's a similar thing. They're on 24-hour watches, continuous radar sound and visual searches. Yep. During daylight hours, they've got air patrols, as we said, that have got a flight director officer on board the Picket destroyer, basically organising them, calling them in.
FDOs, yeah.
As you said, it's like a Battle of Britain air defence system. It's like nautical dowding system.
But what I think is absolutely amazing is there's this dialogue between the pilots and the FDOs, the fighter director officers. They broadcast it on the interfighter director, known as the IFD, which is then played out through loudspeakers throughout each ship in the fleet. So everyone can hear it. This isn't so to sort of keep morale up. This is so that everyone is absolutely clued into what is going on. They're getting a live commentary. So instead of having the kind of the controller over the dais overlooking the map board, in the bunker at Uxbridge, for example, with the Battle of Britain, this is a further development of the system where every sailor is alert and keyed up to what is going on. So they can all see it. And one AA gunnery officer writes, "The IFD Ned was at once our salvation and our entertainment. It prepared us to defend ourselves by following the progress of approaching enemies, and of course, under the circumstances, it was perfectly fascinating."
Incredible. Imagine listening to that.
But they're a decoy as much as a tripwire. That is the truth of these radar Picket destroyers. And they bore the brunt of the kamikazes throughout the whole long Okinawa campaign.
Yeah.
And they're learning on the job. They're learning to maneuver more swiftly and effectively. But, it's an absolute nightmare. So one Picket destroyer, the USS Laffey, which actually survives and then later serves in Korea, was at Radar Picket Station number 1 on the 16th of April when it was attacked by 22 aircraft in 80 minutes. So it's hit by 4 bombs and 6 kamikazes, loses 32 killed in action, 71 wounded. So that's nearly 1/3 of the crew, but amazingly survives. So again, it says something of the skill of the crews, used to manage the damage that's inflicted upon them, but also the strength and sturdiness of US shipbuilding, which is obviously pretty good.
Yeah.
We were talking about sort of quality of steel and things and the kind of depleted steel on Tiger tanks at the end of the war. Well, it's really, really good on the US Navy and saves a lot of lives. That's the truth of it.
But it's a steep cost, isn't it? It's 1 in 3. 15 Picket destroyers are sunk, 50 are damaged, so that's 1 in 3. Total casualties, 1,348 killed in action, of 1,586 wounded. So that's a lot of people. Admiral Turner, I think it's really interesting that he does this, sends a mass of photos of damaged Picket destroyers to Nimitz with a note. These will give you an idea of what our boys are going through. How they ever get their ships back is a mystery, but they are cheerful and do everything they can to keep their ships up here instead of being sent to the rear areas. Morale seems very high, even among our radar Picket vessels, who well realize what they're up against, as do all of us, and they are willing to fight it out on this line. Obviously, it's a big strain, isn't it? And if you're on one of those Picket destroyers, are you going to get it this afternoon? Possibly.
Yeah.
Tough wicket, this, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And of course, the Japanese are sending down all these kamikazes and bombers, conventional bombers and stuff, but also the US are obviously sending bombers up to bomb Japan as well. And Mitscher is sending carrier task groups continually throughout this battle. It's not just in the build-up to Operation Iceberg. It continues once Iceberg begins. And they're repeatedly hammering the Kyushu airfields. They're bombing runways, they're shooting up installations. Never, ever managed to crush the Japanese air menace. And that's because Yugaki's 5th Air Fleet is properly dispersed and hidden and camouflaged. And what they do is they keep them well hidden under cover of daylight. And then at night, they position them under cover, they move them out so that they're taking off at kind of, crack of dawn. Craters are quickly filled. Super fortresses are also coming over, B-29s on every day that the weather allows. And they fly 1,600 bombing sorties on airfields on Kyushu and Shikoku between 8th of April and the 11th of May. But it doesn't seem to matter how much damage they cause or how many Japanese workers they killed. There's always more. And this goes back to that whole point about sort of replicating. There are plentiful numbers of Japanese civilians who are kind of drawn in for this work. By this stage of the war, 88% of the Japanese economy is spending on defense. So everyone is part of this. This is total war and everyone's involved. And you've got to kind of, they haven't got much mechanization now. So it is teams of ant lines of workers with buckets and shovels and doing all this work. But such is the control of the Japanese government and the Japanese imperial hierarchy that they're able to do this. I mean, it's just amazing.
Well, so the Americans, there are developing defense techniques though to deal with the kamikaze menace, aren't there?
Yeah.
So the IFD net will report a bogey and an alarm buzzer will run. A bugler will play, it's sublime of ancient and modern here. A bugler plays boots and saddles to the loudspeakers, and the captain sets condition zebra, which means all watertight doors and hatches are slammed shut. And Admiral Deo's Task Force 54, the bombardment ships, they fall into a defensive circular formation. They emit smoke.
Covered wagons in the Wild West.
Yeah. They put up a smoke screen. Gunners and fire directors scan the skies and listen to the radio dialogue on the IFD, as we talked about earlier. The gunners on the firing line, they man all sorts of anti-aircraft guns from 5-inch to 20 mil. And there's a 40 millimeter Bofors gun that's the most effective. And they're in pairs or quads. The guns has a muzzle velocity of 2,890 feet per second and a cyclic rate of...
It's pretty tidy, isn't it?
It's pretty thick. That'll catch pretty much what you're aiming at. And a cyclic rate of 160 rounds per minute per barrel.
I mean, that's a hell of a lot, isn't it? 160 rounds per minute.
Yeah.
That's a lot of shells.
And it's cannon shells, isn't it? The Bofors. So there's explosive shells as well. So a Bofors with a good crew could hit the Kamikaze a mile out with the flat trajectory range of over 2 miles. So as Lieutenant Robert Wallace, who's an anti-aircraft gunnery on the Idaho, writes, no Kamikaze could get past even a single quad 40 if its people knew what they were doing. So basically, if you know what you're doing, you can, and they're getting better and better. I mean, this is one of these things, isn't it? As ever, people are getting better at this the more they have to deal with it. And so you might be caught out the first time round, but as it evolves, you're getting better at defending yourself.
Say you're on an 88 millimeter anti-tank gun and you're firing up at a B-17, 24,000 feet above you. That's very difficult to hit. You've got something like a 0.002% chance. But if you're trained on a single kamikaze coming towards you, it is coming on a kind of single trajectory. So you've got time to kind of get your bead, start pumping in shells. They also have incendiaries on them as well. So you can see where you're going and, you're going to hit it.
Yeah.
That's the truth. It's a hell of a lot easier than it is doing high-level kind of vertical
Less
bombing.
deflection, haven't you? And you have a proximity fuse, which will explode as it gets very close to the aircraft, which will set the shell off. So hopefully you disintegrate the enemy aircraft rather than allow it to crash into you. April the 12th, so there's another major floating chrysanthemum op ordered by Admiral Ugaki, who thinks it's working. It's 185 kamikazes, 150 fighters, 45 torpedo bombers. And now we know how this goes. So the radar pickets pick them up at around 1 p.m., 129 aircraft. The first Aichi dive bombers, they target the Picket destroyers at number 1 station. And a wall of anti-aircraft fire comes up from the destroyers Purdy and Cassin Young. And 12 enemy aircraft are shot down pretty much immediately. After this, the captain of the USS
I love
Purdy.
this line.
Yeah, well, then give it everything, Jim.
So this captain of the USS Purdy writes in his after-action report, he goes, "The prospects of a long and illustrious career for a destroyer assigned to radar picket station duty is below average expectancy. That duty is extremely hazardous, very tiring, and entirely unenjoyable." That's almost British in its understatement.
Yeah, it is. I'm struck by how, we've talked about the naval war in the Battle of the Atlantic and how that works. How completely different this is.
Yeah, isn't it?
Radically different.
I know. I'm just absolutely. I'm so stunned by its violence.
But this is as different as jungle warfare is different to, Northwestern Europe warfare on the land, conventional land warfare. It might have Navy written on it, but it couldn't be any more different. Later on the 12th of April, Dayo's Task Force 54, they're assaulted again to the west of Okinawa in waters now known as Kamikaze Gulch. That nickname's on the nose, isn't it? Idaho and Tennessee are both hit, as was the destroyer Zealous. Although they're not knocked out, but they're hit. Tennessee suffers 23 killed in action, 106 wounded in action. Zealous loses 26 killed in action when they're kamikazed on the port side. But meanwhile, Task Force 58 avoids any hits, but claims 151 Japanese aircraft shot down. And the fighting goes on till dusk. This is relentless. And it's like...
Isn't it?
This is like something from a zombie film.
That is exactly what it's like.
Waves and waves and waves. And they're already dead, in effect. And, you have to destroy them to stop them. It's got that flavour, hasn't it?
So anyway, the next day, the 13th of April, the news finally reaches them that FDR has died, the president. Most are shocked, saddened, but they're also concerned. Where's that going to leave us? What does that mean for us? The Japanese, on the other hand, are absolutely delighted and think this is all kind of, means that they've got a lifeline. And Japanese news reports that 7 of every 10 carriers have already been sunk and hit, and that the US Navy has suffered 150,000 casualties. And on Okinawa, they released leaflets, propaganda leaflets, which are inevitably pretty poorly distributed by the Japanese. And on this, and not only does it announce these ridiculous claims, it also says not only the late president, but anyone else would die in the excess of worry to hear of such an annihilative damage. The dreadful loss that led your late leader to death will make you orphans on this island. The Japanese Special Attack Corps will sink your vessels to the last destroyer. You will witness it realized in the near future. But I think it's good that we lead with this nod to the troops still battling it out on Okinawa, because, here we are on the 13th of April. And trust me, by that stage, it is no longer the easy ride that it once was. Things are turning very, very badly for the American troops, or the experience of the American troops on Okinawa, as they are for the Japanese troops of the 32nd Army. And in that next episode we do, episode 3, that is when we're going to be turning to the land campaign. And particularly, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be looking at this battle through the experiences of one young Marine in particular, a chap called Bill Pierce.
We're going to zoom in, aren't we, Jim? That's what we're going to do.
Do a slightly different take on this.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We hope that you're as sad, disgusted, and what was the other emotion? Dismayed with this entire business as we are. If you want to listen to these in one streak, of course, subscribe to our Patreon. And it always amazes me that I have to say this. Come to We Have Ways Fest. 12th to 14th of September, where you get an entire weekend of war waffle of this caliber from not just us, but all sorts of speakers of every subject you could possibly want to grapple with to do with the Second World War. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.